The courtroom was filled with an air of hushed anticipation, the kind of quiet that only comes moments before the storm. Officers, lawyers, and a few onlookers were seated, awaiting the start of the day's proceedings. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and in walked Officer Rick, his boots clicking against the polished floor with a rhythmic echo. With his uniform crisp and his posture straight, Rick entered the room like he owned it. He was a man used to command, a seasoned cop who had faced everything from street thugs to high-profile criminals. Today, however, was supposed to be just another day at the office. As he made his way to the officer's bench, he gave a quick nod to a few colleagues, exchanging a few playful jabs and offhand comments. "Hope she's not as tough as they say," Rick muttered, his voice laced with a casual chuckle. "Last time I checked, judges weren't supposed to be as intimidating as linebackers." His colleague, a younger officer who'd only been on the force a couple of years, laughed nervously. "You sure about that?" "They say she doesn't take anyone's crap." Rick waved him off, his grin widening. "It's all show. The tough ones are always the softest when you get to know them." He gave his buddy a wink, the kind of cocky smile that told everyone he'd seen it all and then some. As Rick took his seat, he leaned back comfortably, crossing his arms with the confidence of a man who was about to show the world that he could handle anything. He didn't even glance at the judge's bench, confident that the proceedings would go as they always had. Simple. Predictable. He was here to testify, and the rest was just noise. Then, the room went still. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a quiet but firm thud. Every head turned toward the entrance. Judge Sarah walked in, and the mood in the room shifted instantly. Her presence was commanding, but not because she shouted or made grand gestures. It was the way she moved, calm, measured, but with an undeniable power. She was tall, composed, and radiated a quiet authority that seemed to fill every corner of the room. She wasn't just another judge. No, this was Judge Sarah, the one everyone had heard about, the one whose rulings were never second-guessed. Her reputation preceded her. Known for her strict yet fair judgments, she had earned the respect of everyone who came through her courtroom. To Rick, however, she was just another obstacle to get past. He gave a quick look at his colleague, still smirking. "Here we go. This is going to be fun." Judge Sarah made her way to the bench, her gaze sweeping over the room with a measured precision. When her eyes landed on Rick for just a moment, he straightened instinctively, though the smile never left his face. He made eye contact with her, only to receive a glance so steady, so unyielding, that it sent a slight shiver down his spine. The moment passed, and she took her seat, lifting the gavel with a sharp, deliberate motion. The sound it made when it hit the wooden block was like a signal. "This is it. The trial is beginning." The judge spoke in a clear, authoritative voice, outlining the day's proceedings. Rick, however, was still a bit distracted by her presence. He leaned towards his colleague, keeping his voice low. "I've seen her around. I hear she's strict, but we'll see how tough she really is." His colleague glanced nervously at the judge before whispering back, "You sure you want to joke around like that? They say she's no joke." Rick laughed it off, brushing the comment aside. "It's all an act. Tough judges are always the same. Too serious, too hard-nosed, nothing to worry about." At that moment, Judge Sarah glanced up from the bench, locking eyes with Rick for a brief second. There was no judgment, no expression, just an unspoken understanding that passed between them. She spoke, her voice cool but firm. "Officer Rick, your testimony will begin shortly. I expect it to be thorough." Rick's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He laughed again, more out of habit than anything else. "Sure thing, Your Honor." But deep down, something stirred. A small, almost imperceptible shift in his confidence. He didn't know it yet, but today, he had just made the biggest mistake of underestimating Judge Sarah. Setting the stage for the conflict. The court was buzzing with the usual sounds of papers rustling, the shuffle of feet, and the low murmur of lawyers and witnesses preparing for their turn. But despite the background noise, all eyes were on the case at hand, the first one of the day, a typical drug bust gone wrong, with a suspect in custody and Officer Rick set to testify about the details of the arrest. It was a case Rick had worked on before and one he had no doubt about. He had done his job well, as usual. Judge Sarah sat behind the bench, her eyes steady, focused, as she reviewed the case file in front of her. She hadn't uttered a word since the start of the proceedings, but there was an undeniable tension in the air, like a storm building just on the horizon. The prosecutor called for Officer Rick to take the stand, and with an almost theatrical motion, Rick stood up and adjusted his uniform. He walked toward the witness stand with the same confident swagger he always had. He'd been in dozens of courtrooms like this, facing judges, defense attorneys, and criminals alike. But today felt different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the atmosphere, something about the judge, didn't sit right with him. "Officer Rick," Judge Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, firm but not unkind. "Please take the stand." Rick climbed the steps to the witness stand, offering a polite nod to the prosecutor and a smirk to the defense attorney. He sat, adjusting his seat, preparing himself for what was about to come. He had testified in this courtroom countless times before. This was nothing new. But what was new, what he hadn't expected, was the feeling of eyes on him. The weight of Judge Sarah's gaze was different. Not a glare, not outright hostility, but something much more unnerving, disapproval. A quiet, probing disapproval that made Rick feel as though every word he was about to say was being analyzed under a microscope. He cleared his throat and turned to face the judge. "Ready when you are, Your Honor," he said, his tone laced with the usual confidence, the kind that had gotten him through many situations. Judge Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a moment to study him, her eyes never leaving his face. The pause was enough to make Rick's throat tighten, though he didn't let it show. He had faced much more intimidating people than her. She finally spoke, her voice calm but deliberate. "Officer Rick, please explain to the court what transpired on the night of the arrest." Rick took a deep breath and launched into his story, recounting the events of the night in a practiced, almost robotic way. He described the scene, how he had responded to the emergency call, how the suspect had acted suspiciously, and how he had followed the proper procedures to ensure the arrest was made without incident. But then the questions started. Judge Sarah's tone remained steady, but there was an edge to her words. "You mentioned that the suspect was acting suspiciously. Can you elaborate? What specifically made you suspect him?" Rick blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't a difficult question, but it wasn't one he had anticipated. He paused, collecting his thoughts before responding. "He was hanging around a known drug area. We've dealt with him before. You know, the usual stuff. Suspicious behavior, the usual signs of someone up to no good." Judge Sarah's gaze never wavered. "I see. And can you tell me, Officer Rick, were there any other officers with you at the scene? Did you consult with anyone before making the decision to arrest?" Rick felt the familiar sting of discomfort. "She's digging," he thought. "She wants me to say something wrong." But he quickly dismissed the feeling. He was a professional. He had done everything by the book. "No, Your Honor," he said, trying to keep his tone even. "I was on my own. But I've worked this area before. I knew what I was doing." Judge Sarah nodded slowly. Her next question came without warning. "You mentioned that the suspect had been involved in previous drug-related offenses. Do you happen to recall the details of the most recent case? What were the charges?" Rick's jaw tightened. He had hoped to avoid this. The past case hadn't gone as smoothly as this one, and he wasn't keen on revisiting it. He glanced at the defense attorney, who seemed almost too eager to let the judge dig deeper. He shifted in his seat, trying to appear unaffected, But inside, a small seed of doubt was beginning to grow. "Well, it wasn't a big deal," Rick said, his voice casual. "He was arrested a few months ago for possession. Nothing major." Judge Sarah's expression remained unreadable. "Nothing major? Then why was he placed on probation? Why was he flagged as a repeat offender if the charge was nothing major?" Rick's mind raced, trying to recall the specifics. He didn't like where this was going, but he couldn't back down now. "Well, Your Honor, it was complicated," he said, the words coming out more uncertain than he intended. "Probation is routine. People make mistakes." Judge Sarah's eyes narrowed just slightly, her voice as sharp as ever. "So, you're telling me that despite his prior offenses and probation status, you made the decision to arrest him alone? No second opinion, no further confirmation?" Rick's pulse quickened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. What's she getting at? He had handled things fine. The evidence was solid. There's nothing wrong here, he thought. But the pit in his stomach grew. "No, Your Honor," Rick said, his voice starting to sound less sure. I did what was necessary. The situation was escalating. I acted quickly, as any officer would." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Rick's heart was pounding in his chest now. Something about Judge Sarah's calm, probing questions was starting to make him uneasy. She wasn't acting like the other judges he had faced. Most judges simply listened and nodded. Some were tough, but they didn't question his every move like this. She was methodical, sharp, and somehow too prepared. Judge Sarah's next question was more direct. "Officer Rick, I have reviewed your history. There are inconsistencies in your testimony today compared to your reports. In one of your previous cases, you mentioned being unsure of a suspect's behavior but still made an arrest. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Rick felt the blood drain from his face. He hadn't expected this. He had never been so thoroughly scrutinized. Her questions weren't just about the case, they were about him. "Your Honor, he began, but his voice faltered. "You've been involved in several questionable cases, haven't you, Officer Rick?" Judge Sarah's voice was steady, but her words cut through the air like a blade. "Are you sure your actions on the night of this arrest were above reproach? Or is there something you're not telling this court?" Rick opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come out. His mind was racing. How does she know all this? The unease, the nagging discomfort began to spread. This wasn't just about the case anymore. This judge, this woman, had been watching him, scrutinizing his every move. The more she questioned him, the more he realized she wasn't just tough, she was more than that. She was sharper than anyone he had ever faced, and for the first time in a long time, Officer Rick was no longer certain he was in control of the situation. As the trial progressed, the tension in the room escalated. Officer Rick's earlier confidence began to feel like a distant memory. Each question Judge Sarah asked seemed to peel back another layer of his calm exterior. The courtroom, which had once felt familiar and routine, now felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode at any moment. The defense attorney shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing with a quiet anticipation. Rick tried to maintain his composure, but something in the atmosphere told him that this was far from an ordinary trial. The clock seemed to move slower than ever, and every word Judge Sarah spoke felt deliberate, as though she was building toward something Rick wasn't prepared for. And then it came. Judge Sarah turned to the case file she had meticulously reviewed. She looked up from the papers, and the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. "Officer Rick," she began, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "I've come across something that requires clarification." Rick's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected this. Judge Sarah paused, making sure all eyes were on her before continuing. She reached into a stack of documents and retrieved a file, one that looked a little too familiar. "Let's talk about the case from last year, the one where you were involved in the arrest of a suspect on charges of assault and battery. It's marked as case number 452-89. I've gone through your report and the case details. There are discrepancies here that cannot be ignored. Rick's heart skipped a beat. The case she was referring to was one of his earliest in the force, back when he was still finding his rhythm. He'd made a critical error in judgment during the arrest, a mistake that had haunted him for months but one he had buried in the back of his mind. He thought it was gone, nothing more than a blip in his career, a mistake that he'd learned from and moved past. But now, here it was, staring him in the face. Rick shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, trying to mask his anxiety. "Your Honor," he said, his voice a little shakier than he intended. "That was a long time ago. It was a minor mistake. I've learned from it." Judge Sarah's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "It wasn't a minor mistake, Officer Rick. You failed to follow proper protocol. You failed to secure evidence that could have led to a proper conviction. You failed to protect the rights of the suspect, and most importantly, you failed to do your duty as an officer of the law. And that failure, your failure, had real consequences." The room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on Rick now. His palms grew slick with sweat, and his mind raced to dismiss what she was saying. This can't be happening, he thought. She's over-exaggerating. It was just a small mistake. But Judge Sarah wasn't done. She slid a piece of paper across the desk, the evidence now clearly displayed for all to see. "The suspect you arrested was later found to be innocent," she continued, her voice calm but chilling. "The actual perpetrator was someone entirely different, someone you didn't even consider. The evidence you mishandled led to months of wrongful imprisonment. You cost that man his freedom, Officer Rick. How do you explain that?" Rick's stomach dropped to his knees. His face flushed as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The case that I thought was behind me. The mistake I had buried deep. It's all coming back. The words Judge Sarah spoke reverberated in his mind, louder with each passing second. "I let an innocent man go to jail." Rick opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to push back. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain it? How could he justify the mistake that had changed someone's life forever? Judge Sarah's gaze never wavered. She didn't yell, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The cold, methodical precision with which she laid out his failures was enough. The facts were right there, clear as day, and no matter how much Rick tried to push the truth away, it wouldn't budge. "You were supposed to be the one who upheld justice," Judge Sarah said, her voice low but carrying an undeniable weight. "But instead, you contributed to a miscarriage of justice. This is not just a mistake, Officer Rick. This is something far worse. It's negligence, and negligence can never be justified." Rick's chest tightened, and for the first time in his career, he felt the full weight of his actions. He wasn't a hero anymore. He wasn't the tough guy who always had everything under control. No, right now, he was a man exposed, standing in front of the entire courtroom as the embodiment of failure. He had always prided himself on being the one who made the right calls, who did things by the book. But now that very image was crumbling, piece by piece, in front of him. The room grew unnervingly quiet. The air seemed thick, almost suffocating. Rick could feel every pair of eyes on him, judging him. Judge Sarah's voice broke through the silence once more. But this time, it was softer. Almost as though she was speaking to him as an individual, rather than a defendant. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions, Officer Rick?" His throat was dry. He nodded slowly, unable to form a coherent response. He did understand the consequences. He just never thought he would have to face them. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "This court will take a brief recess," Judge Sarah announced. "Officer Rick, please remain in the courtroom." Rick's legs were shaky as he descended from the witness stand. He felt the eyes of the courtroom follow him. a weight heavier than any he had ever carried. His thoughts were racing, and his pulse was a constant drumbeat in his ears. The defense attorney's voice was a distant hum in the background, but Rick couldn't focus on that. The only thing on his mind was the case he thought was buried. The case that Judge Sarah had just unearthed in front of everyone. His mistake, his negligence, was out in the open now, and there was no way to undo it. As the recess was called, Rick stepped away from the stand and walked to the side of the room, his hands gripping the back of a chair for support. His forehead was slick with sweat. Did I really mess up that badly? The question repeated in his mind like a broken record. The weight of the situation began to settle on him, and the suspense gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He had always been able to brush off mistakes, always been able to charm his way out of tight spots. But this was different. This was something he couldn't escape from. Was I too careless? The doubt gnawed at him like an animal, relentless and insistent. Did I ruin someone's life? And worse yet, he was starting to realize just how deep Judge Sarah's investigation went. She had more on him than he could have ever imagined, and she wasn't going to let it slide. As the court took a recess, Rick's heart pounded in his chest. The world seemed to close in around him, and for the first time in years, he realized he wasn't in control anymore. The brief recess had done nothing to ease the tension in the courtroom. If anything, the silence between the break and the resumption of the trial only made things worse. Officer Rick had no reprieve. His mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a web of fear, guilt, and confusion. The walls of the courtroom, once so familiar and unthreatening, now felt like they were closing in on him. Every step, every breath seemed to echo his growing desperation. Judge Sarah had just exposed his past mistakes, and now, with each passing minute, Rick's confidence was slipping through his fingers like sand. But what had truly unsettled him was something he hadn't even considered. The idea that this wasn't just about one case. What if Judge Sarah knew far more than she was letting on? What if she had been watching him, monitoring his every move, for longer than he had ever suspected? The thought was like a jolt of electricity to his system. He couldn't deny it anymore. The severity of the situation had escalated beyond a single case or a bad arrest. As the gavel struck, signaling the resumption of the trial, Rick braced himself for what would come next. His palms were slick with sweat, his chest tight, and his heart pounding like a drumbeat in his ears. He had tried to keep his cool, tried to ride out this storm. But the storm was building, and there was nowhere to hide. Judge Sarah didn't waste time getting to the point. She addressed Rick with the same cool authority she had maintained from the start, her eyes never leaving him. "Officer Rick," she began, her voice calm, "before we continue, there are a few more things we need to discuss, things that go beyond the scope of today's case." Rick's heart skipped a beat. Things beyond today's case? The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. What was she talking about? Judge Sarah's gaze swept over the courtroom, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, was waiting for what was coming. She continued, her voice smooth but cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You see, Officer Rick," she said, "this court isn't the only place you've been under scrutiny. My investigation into your actions has been ongoing for months. It didn't start with this case. It didn't even start with your previous mistakes that you've tried so desperately to hide. No, Officer Rick, it started long before that. It started the moment you entered this courtroom." Rick's stomach lurched. His mouth went dry, his pulse racing faster with every word. He had heard rumors, whispers, and murmurs about officers who had gotten into trouble. Corruption, mishandling cases, bending the rules. But he had never thought it would happen to him. He had always believed he was one of the good officers. He had done the work, faced the danger. He had built his career on being the tough, reliable one. But now, the truth was crashing down around him. Months? he whispered to himself, his heart thudding in his chest. How long has she known? Judge Sarah's voice was unyielding as she addressed him again, her words landing with a heavy weight. Over the course of your career, Officer Rick, there have been numerous cases where evidence was mishandled, suspects were wrongfully detained, and, in some instances, investigations were deliberately stalled or neglected. You've been under investigation for corruption, and I've been tracking your actions closely. For a long time now, you've been playing a dangerous game. Rick's breath hitched. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was spinning, his body frozen in place. She knows everything. She's been watching me. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had thought he was untouchable, that he could cover up the mistakes, that no one would notice. But Judge Sarah had been tracking him. She had known all along. The courtroom was completely still now. Rick could feel every eye on him, and the weight of their gaze was unbearable. How did she know about all of this? Judge Sarah's eyes softened, but only slightly. There was no sympathy in her gaze, no leniency. She wasn't looking at him like an officer on trial. She was looking at him like a man who had knowingly broken the law. Your actions haven't just been reckless, Officer Rick, she continued. They've been deliberate. You've used your position, your badge, to avoid the consequences of your actions for far too long. You think the system works for you, but the system is bigger than you, and sooner or later the truth always comes to light. Rick's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable. The walls were closing in. What does she want from me? He had made mistakes, sure. But corruption? He never thought it would be exposed like this in front of the world. The weight of his past sins was crushing him, suffocating him. Judge Sarah's voice was calm and deliberate as she continued. I've seen many officers come through my courtroom, some corrupt, some misguided, and some just plain careless. But your case, yours, stands apart. You've been playing a dangerous game for far too long, and now the house of cards is falling, Rick. Rick's mind was racing, but there was no escape. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. Judge Sarah wasn't just a tough judge. She wasn't just interested in punishing him for one mistake. She had been building a case against him for months. The realization was sickening. He had unknowingly walked into a trap, and now it was too late. She had been waiting for him to slip up. The courtroom felt colder now, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. There was no room for denial, no escape from the truth. Every word that Judge Sarah spoke dug deeper into his conscience. And then, in a voice as calm as ever, she delivered the final blow. I am issuing a formal recommendation for a full investigation into your actions, Officer Rick. You're not just here to answer for one case. You're here because your career has been built on a foundation of corruption, and it's time for that foundation to be torn down. You will be suspended pending a full inquiry. The people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed, will not be ignored any longer. Rick's world tilted on its axis. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, his legs unsteady. The weight of the moment, of his mistakes, was overwhelming. I'm finished. Judge Sarah paused for a moment, her eyes locking with his one last time. The verdict is clear, Officer Rick, and the consequences are inevitable. The gavel came down with an almost deafening crack, sealing Rick's fate. The room was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. And in that moment, Rick realized that his life, his career, was over. The nightmare he had been running from for months had just become his reality. The weight of the courtroom was suffocating. The once familiar atmosphere that Rick had so easily navigated now felt foreign, as though he were standing in the eye of a storm. It's over, he thought. There's no way out. I've lost it all. His hands trembled at his sides, his throat dry, as Judge Sarah's final words echoed in his mind. You're here because your career has been built on a foundation of corruption, and it's time for that foundation to be torn down. But just as Rick braced himself for the inevitable, something unexpected happened. Judge Sarah, who had been unwavering in her earlier judgments, looked at Rick with an inscrutable expression. There was no anger in her gaze, only the cold calculation of someone who had seen many like him before. The gavel that had just come down now seemed to hang suspended in the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Rick's body was frozen, his mind in a daze. He waited for the final blow, the announcement of his suspension, the shame, the disgrace. But instead, Judge Sarah surprised him with her next words. "Officer Rick," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you are not beyond redemption. Despite your mistakes, despite your corruption, I am giving you a chance, an opportunity to make things right." Rick blinked, stunned. His heart skipped a beat. What? Did she just say, redeem myself? He couldn't believe it. He had spent his entire career covering up his mistakes, burying the truth, thinking that he could outlast the consequences. Now, in this moment, he was being offered something that seemed too good to be true. A chance for redemption? Was this a trick? A way to make him suffer more? To expose him further? Judge Sarah continued, sensing his confusion. "You have two options, Rick. You can continue down the path you've been on, face the full weight of the law, and let your career end in disgrace. Or you can help in the investigation. You can cooperate with the authorities, provide the information that will help dismantle the corruption within the department. If you do this, I will reconsider the consequences you face." Rick's mind spun. Was this real? Help bring down the corruption I've been a part of? The thought made him sick to his stomach, but at the same time it filled him with a flicker of hope. A chance to make things right, to redeem himself after everything he had done. But the price of redemption was steep. He would have to turn on his own colleagues, the ones who had been complicit in the very system he had helped to build. His breath came in shallow gasps as he processed the gravity of her words. If he cooperated, if he helped bring down the people he had once called allies, he could avoid the harshest punishment. He could, in a way, redeem himself. But if he chose to protect his colleagues, to keep his silence, he would face a much darker fate. The room felt like it was spinning as Rick weighed his options. On one hand, there was the chance to avoid prison, to salvage whatever was left of his career, to somehow claw his way back to some semblance of normalcy. On the other hand, he would be betraying everything he had ever stood for, everything he had built. Was he ready to give it all up? Judge Sarah's eyes remained fixed on him. Her expression hadn't softened, but there was a flicker of something deeper there. Perhaps understanding or maybe pity. She wasn't offering him a way out. She was offering him a choice. She had seen officers like Rick before, men and women who had lived in the shadow of corruption, some who had chosen redemption, and others who had chosen to sink further into the muck. Rick's pulse hammered in his ears as he realized the truth. This is it. This is the moment. His entire future hung in the balance, and the decision he made now would define the rest of his life. Would he be the man who faced the consequences of his actions, who took the hard path toward redemption, or would he fall back into the darkness, choosing to protect his own hide at the expense of others? He took a step forward, then stopped. What do I do? His eyes darted around the courtroom, but all he could see was Judge Sarah's unwavering gaze. The room was silent, every eye on him, waiting. Even the defense attorney, who had once seemed so eager to get this case over with, was watching him now, almost as if expecting a decision. Rick swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Can I do it? Can he betray the people he had worked with? Could he really turn his back on the force he had once sworn to protect? Or would he just accept his fate and let the chips fall where they may? There was no easy answer, no right choice. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His thoughts were a tangled mess. The truth was, Rick was terrified. terrified of facing the consequences of his actions, terrified of turning in his colleagues, of facing the wrath of people he had spent his whole career trying to impress. And yet, there was a glimmer of something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Judge Sarah's words echoed in his mind. You are not beyond redemption. She wasn't offering him forgiveness, not yet. But she was offering him a path, a way out of the nightmare he had created. The choice was his, and he knew it. But the decision would not come easily. Just as Rick was about to speak, a voice inside him urged him to pause, to think before making a choice he could never undo. The seconds stretched into eternity. And then, darkness. The screen faded to black, leaving the courtroom, Rick, and his dilemma behind. The audience was left in suspense, the tension palpable. Would Rick choose the path of redemption, or would he fall deeper into the trap of his own making? Would he betray everything he had known to seek the truth? Or would he cling to his old life, facing the inevitable consequences of his past? The decision hung in the air, unanswered.